Knowing about Ukraine is crucial, is a part of a basic understanding, at least in the realm of European studies. You have to be very well aware of how Ukraine functions as a society. And if you're an urbanist, you have to know at least some of the understanding, have to some understanding about how Ukrainian municipalities, cities, and are growing and are changing.
That's right, and we will try to contribute to this understanding in today's episode. Hi, welcome back to the Cities Reimagined podcast. I'm your voice of choice, Johannes Riehle, and this is episode 7, Reimagining Urbanism in Post-War Ukraine. I hope you're all doing well. It is the end of the year, and to me it seems like the late summer here in Austria just disappeared into a very harsh winter with minus 11 degrees this morning in Vienna today. I hope you can look back at a meaningful year, whatever that means for you. I certainly can. I could work and talk to so many people pushing the envelope on urbanism on the show and offline. I also had the opportunity to travel a lot and get to know so many places and people who are doing really cool things, and connect to those people around the planet. And also to, not least, I could spend some really good time with my loved ones and connect to friends and colleagues in a meaningful way. And not least, I could experiment with this new project called Cities Reimagined. Cities Reimagined will take a short break from here over the holiday season and will be back in January with the remaining episodes of season 1. There has been also so much knowledge collected already in the episode so far that I would love to use it also outside of the pure podcast audio, if you will. And I'm eyeing with the option of a publication summarizing each episode in written form and drawing some conclusions and key messages. But since at the moment Cities Reimagined is run in my free time on my personal budget, I'm a bit limited on how to go about that idea. And if you have some ideas on how to finance it and how to spend time on it, please get in touch. I would love to hear your thoughts on that. In the meantime, I luckily found a way to transcribe each episode for very affordable costs. I will also publish this transcript in one way or the other, maybe a Medium account or something else. But the first non-podcast publication will be featured in a publication by Driving Urban Transitions on regenerative neighborhoods. And I will be editing a conversation I had with Gerfried Ambrosch on urban wildlife habitats, which will be featured in this booklet. If you are enjoying the content of Cities Reimagined, smash the like button, rate and review the show, or leave a comment and a like on LinkedIn or other social media channels to help others find it. But enough on the monologue this week. Let's get to it. Let's get to the topic of today, and that is reimagining urbanism in post-war Ukraine. Yeah, over the years I had the chances of working with colleagues in and from Ukraine, join and talk at a number of UNESCO workshops dedicated on sustainable development practices for urban heritage, which was organized partly by Ukrainian ministries, but took place mainly online because of COVID. And I became very interested in the history and the current political affairs of Ukraine and started reading into it. So mainly I read the work of Anna Reid and Timothy Snyder, which are two authors I would highly recommend to you. I leave the links to their works in the show notes, so you have it ready if you want to read further into that. I also had the chance to go to Kiev in early January 2019, just days before Orthodox Christmas celebrations. It was very cold in the city, and it was snowing, and there was a lot of snow, a layer of snow over the city. That Dnipro river, which flows through the heart of Kiev, had patches of ice forming on the surface, and the city had a very quiet feel to it as the snow muffled all the sounds of the traffic and created a certain sense of stillness. And at the same time, you could realize or recognize that you arrived in a capital where parts of the land of the country are occupied by an aggressor, by the Russian Federation. There were posters of fallen soldiers and others who lost their lives in the east of the country and during the events of the Maidan Square in the year 2014. And these posters reminded that things are not that calm in the country. In the public spaces, there were signs and communications that expressed a deep-seated desire for change and a brighter future of Ukraine. And walking the streets, searching for a restaurant actually, I found myself in an inner courtyard in which Ukrainian soldiers had their standby position. So I left Kiev after the weekend with an impression of a beautiful and cold city, which brings together the historic Orthodox cathedrals, the Soviet-era structures and modern skyscrapers, but foremost that this country is in a military conflict, which was mainly not perceived as such at that time in the West than parts of Europe. In February 2022, what for many from outside of Ukraine thought as unthinkable happened, a large-scale military attack and occupation of Ukrainian land by the Russian Federation. And now in November 2024, an end to this war in Ukraine is not yet in sight. Thousands of civilian Ukrainians were killed, entire cities were put to rubble, and 1.4 million homes were destroyed or damaged. The infrastructure and the historic monuments are destroyed each day. But there's also increased debate and talks about rebuilding those Ukrainian cities, and I had a number of questions on that, on rebuilding Ukrainian cities. And over the last months, I came across the work of Oleksandr Anisimov on rebuilding Ukrainian cities numerous times. He's a spatial planner and territorial governance researcher and consultant with a focus on science policy interface, with a rich experience actually in the NGO sector in Ukraine as well. He published really interesting stuff on matters on rebuilding Ukrainian cities, including affordable housing and sustainable land use, that I had to invite him on the show, and he luckily agreed to have a conversation with me. So here is my conversation with Oleksandr Anisimov on reimagining urbanism in post-war Ukraine. Hi, Oleksandr. It's so nice to have you. It's so nice to have you on Cities Reimagined. How are you doing?
Well, it's maybe already late autumn in Ukraine, but seems fine. Thank you.
Yeah. You're now in, where are you based at the moment? Are you in Helsinki or?
I'm moving, but most of the time I'm based in Lviv. That's Western Ukraine, historic city in the core of Western Ukraine.
Is that the town you grew up in?
No, I moved here, and I moved here when I tried to get a new job. Well, I got the new job, but it was a bit of an experiment because I've never thought of moving anywhere from Kiev before. Although, well, I was nothing like I was completely attached to the city, but it was not like, what would you do in Ukraine? Not being in Kiev, in a sense, was also kind of a question for me. But I moved here to work in a municipality as a specialist in urban infrastructure. So I stayed here, then the war broke out. So I worked there further for a few months, but then I thought, well, there are urgent issues we have to tackle. So I moved a little bit to the NGO sector and started working on research on housing and land use.
All right. So you're moving between. So you're now in Ukraine at this moment.
Yes, at the moment, yes.
I have to say, people will not see that, but I see it. It's very confusing because you have a background of Aalto University near Helsinki, right? So I had in mind that you're sitting in Finland right now.
Yeah, this is specifically designed to be confusing.
Very good. But how did you become interested in urbanism or urban planning or urban studies in the first place? You grew up in Kiev. How was it growing up there, and what triggered your interest in this messy stuff called cities?
Well, I think Kiev was more or less well-organized cities in mid 2000s. So it inherited some of the good and bad Soviet planning solutions, but also pre-Soviet grid network. So the center of the city is pretty walkable, and there is a lot of infrastructure for cultural activities and heritage. So it was not felt like there was a specific difference between Kiev and other cities across Central Europe. I think it was pretty much similar, in a way also better. It had a lot of greenery compared to many cities. Then when I studied political science as my bachelor's degree, so I started to focus on public space. I think it was just a fancy thing to do at the moment. So people started to look something urban. And I read André Lefebvre, and I thought about, well, how do we work on politics of public space? How does that public space is created? How the public space is created, actually? Who were the actors? Who are the political forces behind the curtains, or what are the other institutions basically involved in this creation of public space, and who does it serve? And from then on, I somehow started working on several urban design projects of smaller scale with an NGO called Agents of Change. It's a Kiev-based NGO. And we were trying to utilize some of the European analytical frameworks for public space analysis, for analysis of quality of life, something that people well know about this methodology of Jan Gehl and his team. So some of the different aspects of those approaches that became popular, I think, in 2010s were also on the rise in Kiev, not very much institutionalized in the conversations with the municipal authorities, but at least beginning to be popular among professionals and people just engaged in this kind of urban thinking, who had some free time or had been engaged in voluntary activities, and then started to professionalize it a little bit.
Cool. It seems like public space is a topic where many find their first interest in cities or urbanism. And how did you're now working more on the spatial planning governance side of things, right? Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that?
So there are several directions that I unfortunately have to work on at the same moment, but I think I will move towards something, one of those. And in a sense, there are three directions right now, but they are very much attached to the plans of establishing a research center for land and housing studies within the system of Kharkiv School of Architecture. But from the perspective of my master's studies, I started to look at the in-depth understanding of a planning system, but from the governance perspective, not from the spatial planning itself. So not from the regulations or from some kind of effects of spatial planning as such, but more of the level of governance and land use planning and institutional change, which also a thing that fascinates me, and it's very hard to explain in the conditions where institutions are so weak and it's hard to define, I'd say, as in Ukraine they are. So I combined my previous understanding from political science of things related to political theory of understanding, basically how societies function, and societies function on the level of political society. So if it's a community, how does it organize itself? How does it decide for what are the better rules of governance, or what are the ideas it wants to follow, or how the things are then made into action, so put on paper and then created as an institution of enforcement. And those things, from my background, they allowed me maybe to get a different angle on the spatial planning, because as such, I'm also concerned about some kind of political issues, but I'm really interested in the space as a concept, or in space as a concept, and space as a realm, I'd say. So yes, this is my focus. So the governance part focused with, or combined with the governance part and combined with the land use understanding, I think this is one of the most powerful tools of on the one hand, understanding how cities develop, on the other hand, influencing the future development of those cities, because the issues of how do you define those rules for land use and how you make those rules work are, for me, completely crucial, so that the underlying system of all of the other systems that is built upon it.
Yes, and this topic is also how I got aware of your work, because I saw on LinkedIn that you wrote some articles and posts on regulation, governance behind what is needed in that regard behind rebuilding Ukrainian cities. So I'm very happy that we have a chance for this conversation here today. For me, it's very difficult, honestly, personally, to draft a question on how somebody must feel with living in Ukraine and having the war in front of the doorstep. How are you holding up, and how is this personally? How can you describe that?
I'd say it felt like a fall of the world in the first day or two. So it in a sense felt that reality does not exist anymore, because the material things were no longer they could, it seemed they couldn't hold, like all of the physical things couldn't be destroyed any second. So they were, on the one hand, existing, like this computer or the mouse or the table, but on the other hand, they were possible that they would be taken from you or destroyed by rockets or whatever. So in a sense, it was a bit of a completely redefined feeling of the physical world around me, but also a lot of stress that was mobilizing. So it was a huge desire to do something. It also felt like a physical need to be engaged in things, although I don't have military training and I couldn't be very helpful apart from the humanitarian side of the things. So yeah, we everybody tried to be as much of useful they could. So it was a huge mobilization of the society itself. It still continues, but there was also a lot of fear, and it's a human fear of death or injury or pain. And I think people were super stressed about it. And one of the thoughts that I had in these first days was that, Russia is in a sense taking time from us, because when people are so stressed, when people cannot plan, people cannot think ahead, they become obsessed with their immediate security, and they're basically cut off from thinking. So they're cut off from imagining, they're cut off from discussing this, all of the issues about deliberation, future. They're non-relevant, and basically you cannot build a society on the society that just keeps itself secure. You have to imagine something, you have to plan, and that feeling about Russia taking time from us was a very real one. So it was like a frozen time of fear and stress and mobilization, but still a frozen one. You could not kind of progress in any direction. You were just doing things that had to be done.
Yeah, and you in your work, I know that you're advocating for still in this time where how to put it, in time of survival, or in this times of war, you're advocating for changing the paradigms of how Ukrainian cities are built and hopefully rebuilt. What are the problems and challenges in that regard? How do they differ from other post-Soviet cities? What would you say?
Well, I think none of the cities are any longer post-Soviet in a sense. So just to work on this field of defining the problem itself, or the frame itself. 5 years ago, my distant colleague published a paper, 3 metals something. I just don't recall the whole name, but Michael Gentile, he's a Swedish researcher working in Norwegian university. He basically launched a counterattack on the concept of post-socialist explanatory framework or post-socialist word as concept term. So he fought it back in a very good way, a very strong argumentation. He brought together several examples of cities that are still considered by some of the researchers or in some literature post-Soviet, and he just tried to link them somehow, and it didn't work. So you couldn't find a single characteristic that could link those cities together. And there was a very good framing that he counterattacked this idea about post-socialism, is that it confines the production of knowledge about post-socialism to this constant peripheral condition, because you can now never overcome the reproducibility, the relevance of the knowledge you produce about post-socialist cities beyond the post-socialist cities themselves. So in a sense, whatever you whatever you tell about post-socialist cities means something only in the framework of other post-socialist conditioned cities, and something you can never argue anything about, global south, east, west, north, and so on. So you're stuck there. And I think we have to go beyond that. It just helps to kind of bring something of an identifier, but what's behind it really very hard to define.
Is it a matter of the term post-socialist, or is it?
Yes. I think it's just exhausted itself, and it doesn't. It answers the wrong question, I'd say. So if we want to learn something, we should ask different questions. We should ask questions about the region or the country or the history or a building or a city or a community. We shouldn't ask a question about post-socialism.
Excellent, very good. For changing the paradigms in Ukraine, what is needed now for, let's say, rebuilding the cities? Or
I would say the concern is twofold. So one concern is, how do we deliver the promises of deliberative democracy and inclusion in the level of the community of what's in Ukraine is also municipality is called the community. So it's a literal translation. So you if you live in a municipality, you automatically live in a community. In a sense, how do cities that don't have funds, that don't have capacity, that are people who work in municipality, they don't have proper funding, they don't have proper salaries, how those municipalities being confined for so many years, even after some decentralization efforts have been done in Ukraine, which is a strong reform that's been happening in the last 5-7 years, how do those municipalities actually deliver those promises? Because people are, I guess, over-expecting. And international community is over-expecting, and everybody's thinking, well, we have now this perspective of European accession, Union accession. Now we have to deliver. We have to be, at least as good as some other countries are. And I cannot say that we have the foundations for that transition. So on an institutional level, the way the country was ran is way too chaotic in a regional perspective. And municipalities are very different by their capacities, and they're very different by their ability to think forward or to mobilize any kind of resources. And they're very dependent on, I would say, local trajectories of how things developed. And those trajectories were, in most cases, not very positive, not very forward-looking. So the one question is about the capacity of the local level itself, to build forward, to create and then the needed kind of engage in the needed reforms on the local level. And then the other side is, in a sense, what is the professional and the state paradigm of how do we do things from the planning perspective, right? How do we think about the quality of life in those communities, in the country? And I think there is also a crisis of ideas on that behalf. So although I'm very much of institutionalist perspective thinker, in this case, I engage in more of a discursive problem, because I think we have a crisis of imagination on that side. And this is a point where comparison is maybe not the best solution, but a very interesting one. Because looking at the destruction that was brought by the Second World War in a lot of European states, it was hard to see any of the countries building back worse. So in a sense, every of those countries engaged in a huge mobilization of societal resources, institutions, political engagement. They redefined social contracts. They created so much of a new institutions that still hold. We can name you name it: NHS in Britain, social pensions in Netherlands, movement and workers' rights in Germany, housing in Sweden. There are so many institutions built from Second World War, designed on the basis of new social imagination of politicians and their expert groups that supported those politicians to think forward. And this is not there in Ukraine. So I very well understand that we are in a sense of this post-crisis condition. So neoliberalism has fallen, but what's kind of next? So what do we propose for the society and for the global economy? And in our case, we cannot just continue the trajectory. We will slide into one or the other condition. It's by definition something that we're going to have, because so many things were destroyed, and they will be rebuilt on one conditions or other conditions. And one of the perspectives I'm arguing for on this kind of a level of political imagination about cities, about communities, is that we actually have to get back to the social state. So the state that provides for its citizens, and the idea of deliberative social democracy, I think, maybe in the words of Thomas Piketty, it's a bit of different conditions, but it's a kind of a system that works for the people who invest in that system. And there is a strong counter movement on the political side. So we still have to kind of keep the taxes low. We have to keep the private entrepreneurs and private businesses kind of running the economy, running it forward, moving it to some kind of a new innovative thinking, blah, blah, blah. However, coming back to, and how do we keep people in Ukraine then? Obviously, 5% of people who engage in this nice jobs related to IT, related to some kind of a marketing business, they will stay, might stay. And then what we're talking about, the other 90% of people, how do we deliver for those teachers, for those policemen, for those building workers? How do we create a system that really values their input? And this is something behind, questions of what are the cities we're going to build, and very much related to the idea of social housing and, housing for all.
And this is excellent. And this is, you referred, I would like to stick for a second with this crisis of imagination, which you put forward so strongly. You also mentioned that after the Second World War in Europe, there was a lot of, let's say, social achievements, and a lot of things all of a sudden were possible, which didn't seem possible before, but there might also have been a lot of experimentation, right? An open mind potentially to improve the social conditions of people, right? And then just experimenting with it and going along with that. Do you think that this crisis of imagination is in Ukraine? Is that historically? Is it politically? Are there reasons for that culturally? Or do you think it's just this bigger economic model we are in? You mentioned the neoliberalism, that this notion of neoliberalism in a way prevents people or institutions to have bolder ideas, visions about the future. What do you think?
Well, I will try to answer in two parts. So one part is about the imagination itself, and I think it's very much related to some of the concepts that Mariana Mazzucato put forward in regards to how do we define the value that the state can provide for the society. So, and thinking about that value is very much predefined in Ukraine because the state for so long has been defunding itself. So it has been consistently shrinking, well, maybe not consistently, but inconsistently shrinking. And then it doesn't have its internal ambition or capacity to think about bigger change, to believe that the value and the progress that it can deliver can actually mean something or can be as big as it has to be, or as counter intuitive maybe to some people, but still providing a lot of social value, a lot of public value for the society. And that consistent shrinking of public institutions obviously lent market the hand to think for those institutions. So taking one sector, and the one that I've been working with for some time, although I'm not really an expert in housing, in housing sphere, the state as a, well, public entities, they rely on private data, they rely on private advice, because they have not built any research capacities and research institutional capacities themselves. So they systematically rely on what private entities provide for them, and then they do not have any other arguments, and they don't have any other things on their horizon other than those that were put forward by the private sector. And thus the only thing that is there in the discourse is only things put forward by the private sector, meaning that you cannot actually engage with public institutions because they are in a sense captured or kind of controlled, not physically, not even financially, but by their ideas that they cannot themselves think about. They were just, fed these ideas by the private sector. And this correlation exists in several sectors of Ukrainian economy. When we think about, social perspectives, they just step back and, wait for somebody else to answer these questions, or maybe just put them aside or under the rug or somewhere.
Is the reason for that the financial resources, or what is the reason for that?
So thinking about, we have this defunded public entities that stop thinking forward and just rely on this day-to-day work or day-to-day provision of answers or services to politicians or the parliament or the cabinet of ministers. They don't come up with these ideas because they don't feel themselves secure and being able to put forward these ideas. And why is that? I think it depends on different levels. I cannot say I have an answer, but this is something that I've been facing, that you engage with people who have very low ambitions and expectations about the future. And it's very hard when you have such a huge problem of destruction and displacement, because you have to think big. Otherwise, it just doesn't work together at all.
Right. What's your personal hope for the recovery of Ukrainian cities?
Well, paradoxically, I think one of the things that happened is indeed decolonization of consciousness in a lot of ways, because it doesn't have immediate effects on the physical reality of how people care about the city or how they engage in local politics, but they are definitely no longer captured by some kind of idea that there will be some public entity providing something and things will be just automatically better. I think there is a lot of things that people started to think about before the war, but also are now enshrined in this voluntary activity on all fronts, where people just do things themselves. So there are some expectations on behalf of the local authorities, but people actually engage. So people do things that nobody asked them to do, and they won't stop. I mean, they won't stop if the municipal authority says, well, you shouldn't. Maybe they will say, shut up, we're providing services, we're doing the right thing, so on, so on. So in a lot of places, it's no longer, the authorities are just sitting and listening to civil society, because civil society has much better capacity and understanding of what has to be done. And it's kind of civil society is jumping over the municipal authorities and talking with donors or talking with state entities or something. So I think this is quite an interesting condition that we haven't seen, in Europe. I don't know what kind of society had this mobilization of resources in the last decades. more related to kind of spatial planning issues is my concern that we have a huge trouble translating quality standards of living into things that matter in spatial planning. And this is a complicated task in every city. And what the research says, in very simple words, is that, well, you need to have a very strong hold of governmental capacity to hold, those land consumption back. And if you do, land consumption is much lower and the density of construction is much higher. And thus we could correlate that with the quality of public service provision, transport, and so on. And I think this thinking is not yet in Ukraine at all right now. There has to be a lot of effort done on behalf of different European also institutions to promote the agenda that we actually need to think from the perspective of ecological system, within the country. How do we keep land open? How do we keep it natural? How we don't consume much more land? Because in Ukraine, it's very easy to compare data before the war and after the war. What has happened also on the geographical level, I think something like the whole territory of Belgium in Ukraine is now mined. So it's either mined and shelled, or shelled and mined, or has some other hazards and mined. And it's basically unusable. So imagine you just cut off Belgium out of European map. It's a bit too much, I think, to handle for just one jump. And it happened in Ukraine in a year. So we lost huge territories. It's 27 to 30% of land that is mined, and it has to be cleared somehow. And they clean it, but it's a very slow process. And also sometimes you cannot really clean it because the quality of soil just is not, even after you clean it up, it's not really usable. It's degraded too much, or it's just filled with metal or scrap or some kind of fumes from the shells and other things, or oil from tanks. So it's basically a barren wasteland. And Ukraine was this kind of a breadbasket feeding 400 million people in the world. But then the pressure for agriculture does not just go away. It just moves its need for land resources to the western parts of Ukraine, where there were no hostilities. And now the pressure for land use is even accelerating. And we're not even touching on the points such as, wind farms, solar energy production, and so on and so on. So the land consumption perspective in Ukraine is huge. It can just, every day it can just be growing exponentially from where we are now. It's because the economic activity is low right now, and there are a lot of issues about how you invest. But as soon as investment is there and we don't have real controls in place, market always finds a way how to go around some of the more or less lousy legislation that is there. So this is a crucial problem for the recovery, about how we think about Ukraine as an ecosystem and the land use in the country. And this is why I'm skeptical about this kind of a localized approach, because on the local level, you don't see these numbers adding up. You see small, kind of just a small glimpse on the bigger picture, where the public authorities, national level and regional level, really have to think about.
I would like to pick up on your first point on the self-organization of people, of communities in cities, and the resilience they show during the times of war. I find it very fascinating that you described that people living in cities or organizations, I think, are they organized somehow? Are they NGOs, or is it just people who come together for a shared purpose?
It's very easy to start up an NGO in Ukraine, and somehow NGOs cover 70 to 80% of all local activities. So it's somehow mediated by an NGO, because as soon as you have a legal structure, then you can send out official letters, you can receive those official letters, you can participate on behalf of your NGO. So it kind of levels up your status, maybe not that much, but still you have a much more many more opportunities to engage in local politics. And you also, which is, I think, crucially important, then you kind of negotiate with international partners on behalf of the so-called organization or institution, even there are 5 people there, they will never know in a sense, but they know that they're engaging with a legal entity, you know, and that proves a lot of things that are possible now. And, you know, I mean, NGOs are, well, I don't know about the financial flows overall, but I think the capacity of NGOs to receive and spend money is getting better and better. And this capacity is assisting local municipalities into providing other services or thinking even that they don't themselves are unable to provide.
Do you think that this is something that these NGOs or these local, let's say, purposefully formed groups of people will have a bigger role to play after the war and in the governance system after the war?
Well, that's a good question because it's really hard to predict. And also, I don't have enough data to understand, or maybe to compare the pre-war conditions and the post-war conditions. There is some research done on the appreciation of local NGOs and trust to local NGOs, and I think it's kept much higher than trust to the local authorities. So people trust those NGOs even though they don't elect them, they don't kind of, they are unable to make them accountable. Really, they really trust those NGOs.
Because to me, it sounds like you mobilize or you forced society, or the Ukrainian society has to show a certain resilience in these times, right? And then they come together and bring these resources, mobilize their ideas and also resources, financial or other resources together. It would be, you know, very interesting to see how you can use that after the war, and also to exactly what you mentioned before, to build upon this mobilization for reimagining cities.
Well, here I might a bit divert from your line of thinking, because I think for proper, well, cities are, as we know, are getting more and more complex day by day because of the involvement of different stakeholders, you know, complicated networks of infrastructure, digital institutions of whatever, public, private authorities. So the things are just getting more complicated. And I think NGOs have their own limit of how far they can. So I believe the deprofessionalization of the idea of city management is a good and a bad thing. So it is good because it opens up people to more thinking about how do we want to live together on this, you know, small world we have. But it also depreciates the quality of professional education, because you can no longer represent to have an incredible condition of knowledge or information or just basically experience from your work that other people have to rely on. Well, because they haven't done that, they don't know that. They just, you know, jump up with their ideas, learn from somebody across the street or in the internet, and then they say, well, we should do that. Whether that's a good use of public money, whether that's a long-term investment.
Well, I think it might not be that you hand out the decision to somebody who's not an expert, but it's about valuing the knowledge and the everyday.
It becomes a conflict. I would say that you're correct, and that's a good point. But I'm always afraid.
Sorry, I just meant bringing in these voices and this this mobilization or this perspective into co-creating approaches for city making. Really, you know, it's like at the end of the day, you need to have a leadership which takes the decisions, and you need to have a decision laid out by experts, but also by maybe not disciplinary experts, but everyday life experts, right? So it's bringing these voices together to maybe reimagine a future for cities.
This is an interesting question again. Thank you for it, because what I also felt from my studies and engaging with discussions about municipal management in other capitals or in other cities in Europe, so a lot of this process were happening in different European cities in different speeds. But thinking about the Ukrainian context, it is quite different in a sense that while those things have been brought on the table, you also have a decrease, or maybe you didn't have any increase of quality or the capacity of local municipality. So municipality now is unable neither to handle properly the engagement and co-creation, nor their basic institutional work that they have to do. And they're now a turn between those two ideas because they have to respond to all of the ideas of deliberative democracy and everyday engagement, and to do this complex technocratic stuff they have to do. And they're not really competent in neither of those. And this brings to me the table, what is the priority, or how do you invest in the capacity on the local level for those people to be able to plan forward and to be open? I found this a conflict talking with a lot of European professionals. They highly express the need to have more public engagement, have to take on the initiatives that already exist there and just enhance them, not to push anything. But then it is a good plan, but for different conditions, I think. And those conditions have to be taken into account when thinking about the longer term goals. How do you balance this kind of a technical and conceptual needs of the city with this new paradigms of management of, local management of things, and how do you engage people in that?
Oleksandr, with so much destruction and in Ukraine, and you described how much land has been destroyed and is polluted also for the war, from the war. And we discussed a lot of details, regulations, governance issues around that. Wouldn't you say that the priority should be to build housing and infrastructure on a very rapid pace, to focus on that instead of let's say the nice to haves around that?
Well, that's a very good question, because what it leads to is a dichotomy, which I think is a bit of unproductive. And I would rather a bit of reframe the question about how do we learn by doing things? How do we, from the start, how do we not delay the process, but how do we start the process the way that it builds a system of knowledge, or builds this kind of a learning capacity from within the project by project thinking towards a planning perspective, or towards the perspective of how do we kind of organize things together on a level of municipal plan or general plan, or regional plan. Myself, I'm for planning. There is some argument. Theory saves all. I think plan saves all. So plan do save a lot of things, but with the given conditions, it is more about how do we make those plans work. And at the given moment, I don't think we know how to make those plans work. So we had a lot of plans in the country. We were a huge plan-producing country since the Soviet Union. Most of those plans were never realized to any significant extent. And how do we learn, maybe without a plan? How do we systematize those projects? How do we systematize that thinking towards the plan we need? And I think this is maybe a better kind of way of trying to push things together. Integrated urban development, so to say, which is a German term, but I think it has a chance of revival in these conditions by becoming more informal, but becoming a way of doing, not a way of planning, and then feeding up to those people who actually sit in the planning institute, and then they see, well, this is the way things work, and we should plan as things work, and not to plan for the things that we would like them to work.
And for rebuilding Ukrainian cities, if you go in that line of thinking, what would be the next practical steps to rebuild Ukrainian cities from your perspective, from your work, but also feel free to be very personal with your opinion.
Well, I say it's kind of a vision for the social city. This is also on the level of country, but related to our podcast, I think it's more interesting to think about what is the social city that provides for people who live there. And it's about all of those conditions. So it's about how do we, at the same moment, as planners, as people who think further, take into account healthcare. How do we take into account everyday use of space? How do we take into account mobility? How do we take into account access to decent housing? How do we take into account greenery? How do we take into account new jobs and work areas and access to those work areas? So in a sense, from this fragmentation that we were facing earlier, designing solutions for a very small kind of, planned areas, whatever was there, just putting buildings together. It is about a bit of going back and understanding that what's behind, physical plans or legal plans is our internal understanding of how do we think these cities should look like. And it's especially relevant for cities that have been heavily damaged, such as Kharkiv or Mykolaiv, because they have to prove something to the world after the war is over that their place is worth living, right? Because I don't think you can rebuild a city that it just works for the few. It won't help anybody to get back there, and it will be a dysfunctional economy, constantly shrinking system that relies on defunct Soviet infrastructure, maybe with a few pedestrian central streets. So it's about actually not this investment, as an extra investment for social facilities, but as investment into people who would love to work and live there. And this thinking is what I haven't seen in Ukraine that much. And I believe this is the kind of a financial thinking that was burdened by constant lack of funds, but with the opportunity of a very clever use of recovery funds that we think are going to come, we should actually put this kind of a social before every other word. So if we are talking about infrastructure, it has to have its social component there. It has to have housing, has to have its social component there. And to be competitive, it's not about being economically competitive. It's about first being socially competitive, and then economy can repay for itself. And it's what happened in a lot of cities in the world.
And how would you say, I think in the beginning you mentioned how to put it, but it was like the perspective of European researchers and policymakers on Ukrainian cities should shift, and there should be more knowledge, if I interpret you correctly, more knowledge built up in Western Europe or about urbanism and other things in Ukraine.
Well, I can't say, you just measure it by the size, but Kyiv is the fifth biggest city in Europe. So it has to have at least some appeal to trying to understand how big cities work and how they impact global economy. But what I think we started to discuss before the recording is that, coming from, I don't know, Danish, Scottish, Spanish background, people consider Ukraine, something being out of their scope of interest, maybe automatically because it's not really belonging to any area of research they've been looking at. And I think this leads to a specific condition where Ukraine, is confined, as I said, to this periphery. So although it's the biggest country by area in Europe and it provides the most, a lot of resources, corn, we are talking about wheat, we're talking about sunflower oil, a lot of products that Europe actually imports from Ukraine and is heavily dependent on some of those things. How do we make Ukraine visible productively for international academia? Because trying to launch any international projects of relevance and value production in science, how do you make Ukraine relatively interesting for those points? I think it's by making Ukraine legible on the map so that people do not start those conversations with the excuses that they don't know anything about Ukraine. So yeah, you can tell us something, but this is just another interesting point we can learn about, but not really a necessary one. I think knowing about Ukraine is crucial, is a part of a basic understanding, at least in the realm of European studies. You have to be very well aware of how Ukraine functions as a society. And if you're an urbanist, you have to know at least some of the some understanding about how Ukrainian municipalities, cities, and are growing and are changing. Because that would bring, on the one hand, much more perspective to different issues discussed in Europe, the transfer of policies, the thinking about how those policies land up, how do we consume land, how do we grow, also how do we work with cities that are experiencing decline. There is a lot of areas that Ukraine can be part of this research engagement on international academic level, but it is not, as people consider it, being, an case in itself, not really reproducible, not really comparable. And I think starting to make Ukraine visible on the basic level, to be able to engage with people, at least that Ukraine is something not out of their scope of thinking, but a part of the normal conversations, part of the general agenda of research, is very important to me. And this is one of the things that I wanted to argue here.
Right. Thank you so much, Oleksandr. I would, since you have so many, you have different hats. So I see you wearing different hats. You're active in an NGO sector. You're a researcher and academic yourself, but you also work with municipalities. If you would suggest, let's say, 3 things to anybody who wants to reimagining cities or change anything in their immediate urban environment, what would these 3 suggestions be?
From working in the municipality, I learned that to actually produce change, you have to work very hard. And in a sense, this working hard is not a joke, not maybe some kind of a head-on idea, but this is a reality. So if you want to see things changing on a local level, you have to be ready for a marathon or for a very long run, because there are a lot of institutions, there are a lot of people with different backgrounds engaged in this decision making. And you can change things, but you have to be sure that you're committed to this and that you're ready to face difficulties and ready to go on with some things being unchanged for years, I imagine. From being in an NGO, I learned that NGOs are very fancy for thinking about cities, are very interesting for young researchers or people who are engaged in this society on different levels, but their influence is very limited. And if you are looking towards making things different, on a bigger scale, it might be better that you think about how do I convert my knowledge from an NGO to be relevant for policymakers and maybe to become a policymaker yourself. And these things combined, I imagine, are both relevant for people who work in the municipality and who start often to be overpressed with their everyday work, and they don't see, an ending of this. But they can make a change, and I've seen it happening. But they have to keep the fire going. And people who don't see the change happening in NGOs, the society is still being the same, or the city is functioning the same way they did previously. They have to realize that past dependencies are very strong, and you have to leverage in a very specific area to produce a change. And it's not an easy thing to do, but it's still possible.
Oleksandr, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for giving me and us really an insight into Ukrainian urbanism before and during and after the war. I would love to meet you at some point, ideally in Ukraine after the war. Yeah, all the best to you, to your family, and your colleagues. And I hope we stay in touch. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Johannes. It was a pleasure.
That was all for this week's show. If you like the content, I would be happy if you subscribe to the channel or rate the show, or send me an email at johannes@anthropocene.cities. Cities Reimagined will take a short break over the Christmas holidays and we'll be back in January with new episodes. And we will finish off season 1 and then decide if we go into a second season and how that should look like. Thanks for listening, and I hope to catch you soon.